All right, so let me get started. So let me welcome you to our webinar today, Who Benefits from Higher Tariffs, a conversation with research economists. I'm Bart Lipman. I'm the Associate Dean of the Faculty for Mathematical and Computational Sciences here at BU. It consists of the departments I work with are math and statistics, computer science, and as you would guess from this webinar, economics. So today we're fortunate to have two very smart, very articulate experts on this subject to talk to us about what's going on in the world with tariffs and how to think about the issues. So the plan here is I'm going to very briefly introduce the topic, then I'll introduce these two smart people here with me to you, and then I'll ask them a question or two to kind of get the ball rolling. And then as soon as we can, we'll move on to your questions. So to ask a question, there's a little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen there. I encourage you to tap that and enter a question as soon as one occurs to you. We'll get to as many of them as we have time to get to. I'll keep my remarks, my part of this thing short if we see a lot of questions flooding in. And I hope you find it all very interesting. So the topic I already mentioned, tariffs. This is something that 10 years ago was maybe not the topic it is now. It was not a big source of government revenue or that much political controversy, and in recent years, it's really come to the fore, and so it becomes a topic of great interest. Let me introduce the panelists who are going to be explaining this to you. So going in alphabetical order by last name, Tariq Hassan. Tariq did his undergraduate studies in Germany, his PhD at Harvard. We stole him away from University of Chicago Booth School of Business in 2017. He's an expert on a wide range of issues, including immigration and more directly relevant to today, international finance. Second, we have Natalia Raimondo, who did her undergraduate studies in Argentina and then her PhD at University of Chicago. We stole her away from UC San Diego in 2020. No doubt attracting her because of the better weather here. She's an expert on international trade and globalization and has particular interest in multinational firms. So let me get started with a couple of general questions. Let me start, Tariq, with you. A lot of the discussion about tariffs has been about the trade deficit and trying to close the trade deficit. Is this a goal we should be focused on? And if so, is this a good tool for that purpose?
Yeah, so thank you very much for that kind of introduction, Bart. So if I'm going to say one thing today, it's that a trade deficit is not necessarily a bad thing. And in the case of the US, I think it's clearly a sign of the US's strength in the world. So the premise that we should go out and try and eliminate the trade deficit, I think is fundamentally wrong. And I can explain why. So the first thing is that a country is not a company. And we have this thing that's called trade deficit, but it's in some ways really poorly named, because all it means is there's the value of goods coming in is bigger than the value of goods going out. So we're getting more stuff from abroad than we're sending there. And that on the surface sounds like a good thing, right? And the reason it sounds like a good thing is because it also kind of is. So the only way you can have a trade deficit is by having foreigners invest in the US more than Americans are investing abroad. So the trade deficit actually is exactly the same thing as an investment surplus. So the US has a giant investment surplus. So the first thing is you can't have both mathematically, okay? So you cannot have foreigners investing a lot in the US and at the same time have a trade surplus. All right, so these two things are mutually exclusive. So in the Trump language, you can either win on trade or you can win on investments. All right, but it's not all that simple. So why do we have this big investment surplus? So the big investment surplus is just a symptom of the fact that lots and lots of people from abroad want to buy US assets. And there's really two key reasons for that. The first is that the dollar is used all over the world to settle payments. People all over the world want to save in dollars, and they have to come from somewhere. And that's what the US does. The US exports dollars and financial assets that have US dollars printed on them. So think of a world where, like, outside of the US, people are using the dollar to pay. The economy outside of the US is growing. So every year we get to print a little more money and issue more bonds that have dollars printed on them just because the foreign economy is growing. Now, what are we getting in return for these dollars that we're shipping abroad? Well, that's stuff. And that stuff shows up as the trade deficit, right? So in that sense, the trade deficit is a sign of US strength and a sign of US dominance in the world. This is also the reason why, you might remember, in 2018, we've had this conversation before. Okay, we've been exactly here, except with a less extreme attitude. So in 2018, Trump started raising all kinds of tariffs in the hopes of eliminating the trade deficit. Did they eliminate the trade deficit? No. Okay, it's still here. And the reason it's still here is because there's still strong demand from foreigners to buy US assets. And what that's doing to the US economy is it lowers borrowing rates for US households and corporations and stimulating our economy as a result. So it's not at all clear that you want to eliminate this trade deficit. People are pretending like obviously you want to eliminate it. I would strongly disagree with that idea.
Okay, thanks. Let me turn to Natalia, and let's turn more to sort of the micro side of this. So let me ask this in two pieces. So when there's a tariff put on foreign goods, first of all, let's be clear on who is writing the check for the bill that says tariff on it. But second, more broadly, who ends up paying, bearing the cost of that? Who gains and who loses?
Thanks, Bar, and thanks for the introduction before. So let's start with the mechanics, like the very simple, what do? You arrive at customs, and now there is an importer, there is the intermediary that says buy the shoes or t-shirts in China and import them, and they pay, right? In like de facto, like the price say $100, and now the tariff is 25%, that they pay that over their imports. But then they have to sell it to somebody inside the US. And that's when we know that that's passed. Empirical study shows that that's passed totally in their totality to consumers. And again, this is like very schematic, and we teach it undergrads in our courses, like what the tariff does. That is somebody that gains. That will be the import competitive industry. In my example, say somebody that produces shoes in the US or a t-shirt. Those are the producers, but then the consumer disproportionately will lose. And that even considering if you think that there is something related to revenues for tariffs that the government gets, and if everything were working perfectly, they can give back to consumers. Even with that on it, there is a net loss. And it's like the most like design is like this total pass-through of the tariff to consumers. So, and actually consumers they realize that. And even now, if you look at yesterday, the consumer sentiment index that Michigan University produces, consumers are they say, oh, prices are going to increase big time, right? So consumers realize, even if we are split, we are not like concentrated like companies are. So the other textbook case that I don't think it happens, and it's like
Natalia, can I just ask one question about that? So
yeah.
So when Trump says the foreigners are paying for it, what he's hoping is that the importer who's now paying more is going to call the Chinese maker of shoes and say, hey, my government is now charging me 20%. Can you lower your price? How often does that actually happen? I mean, I kind of, so I like German beer and I'm not really kind of willing to compromise on that. So I'm going to pay whatever it takes. So I get my German beer. And if I call the brewery and say, look, you have to charge me less now because I have to pay 20% tax to Donald Trump, I don't think they're going to take my call. So like who are like the companies that are going to renegotiate prices?
In the textbook case, that happens if the US is so big that you are able to pressure the foreign producer and lower the price. But in reality, that doesn't happen. Those producers are big, they have other markets to go. That price is not moved in general on the big picture by.
But is it right to say that like sort of if Walmart buys most of the shoes from a given Chinese exporter, that Walmart maybe can renegotiate, but like maybe like the Aldo's shoe shop here in Harvard Square, or like a smaller retailer probably can't. Is that about right?
They could, but it's not going to be. At the end of the day, maybe it's not the 25% of the tariffs. It's a little less, 20%, but prices internally, the Aldo shoe will go up. And that gets compound. Like I gave you a very straightforward case, but reality is a bit more complicated. Even imagine you could do that and negotiate, and the so-called terms of trade of the US, like the price of export over import, increases. That supposedly is always a good thing. There are a lot of things to consider. First, what I told you is like a snapshot, right? It's today. What happened tomorrow, and it happened with the US-China trade war in 2010, the other countries start retaliating. And they're going to start raising tariffs in other products that are not exactly the same, and they're going to do it in a way that hurts certain sectors of the economy in the US more. So that will be coming if we know it already happened with China. And so that's one thing, retaliation, right? And by the way, like doing a little bit of history, this happened in the 30s, and we didn't want to happen again. So after Second World War, we created this multilateral organization. So the WTO wasn't called the WTO, were rounds of negotiations, but we kind of countries start agreeing on how to reduce tariffs. And that's because we didn't want these escalations like in the 30s, where everybody closed their economies and they reverted to autarky, and then there was the Great Depression. So that's one. The other one is like every time you put tariffs, you give room for lobbying, because now you want the exceptions, right? So now we have tariffs in this particular industry. There is the famous case of the washing machines. And now, okay, now I want an exception. I'm this company, I'm going to ask for an exception. So they reduce my tariffs. And there are other trade instruments to do this. So, okay, you can see how there is the political quid pro quo maybe there. Okay, so
there's a beautiful paper about tariffs into Egypt. Okay, Egypt's kind of easy because you can kind of tell like which company is a friend of the regime, right? So, and you would look at like, so there was like this sort of like extremely granular variation in tariffs, like very specific things like, this kind of like plastic toy needs either pays a tariff or needs an extra safety inspection. And you go and look at like who owns the company in Egypt that makes these kinds of toys. And it's like a friend of Hosni Mubarak. Right? So in some sense, that paper basically showed that the entire variation in tariffs for that country basically came from who's friends with the president. And that does not, like, it sounds like, a couple of months ago, you might have said that's never going to happen in the US. Now it's not so clear, right? So we're talking.
I didn't want to say that, but yeah, there is that.
There is already studies that show that for the 2018 trade war and where the political donations went disproportionately. So you can imagine the answer. But
Yeah.
so yeah, so there is something, because we can people like can track this, which firms receive exceptions and what are their donations. So, but let me touch one more thing. So the global value chain, the fact that now companies don't produce everything in one place, but they split across many locations, sometimes in different countries, what they produce. So think about a car, it's produced in many, many, many steps that are all over the world. And that's our relationship with Mexico and Canada, right? So Tarek was surprised the other day when I told him that to finish a car, for instance, the unfinished, the input and then the output cross the border with Mexico on average 7 or 8 times. So if you think about tariffs, think about the worst scenario. That is across the board. Everything gets a tariff of 20%, 25%. You are compounding the effect, because every time the unfinished product and all those steps you need to produce them cross the border from Mexico to the US. And imagine on top of that, there is retaliation. So both ways it's compounded. So it's 25% like over and over and over all those times till the car comes to the US like finished. Okay, and let me give you a statistic. This is
Natalia, but now you just, so this relates to Matt Rotman's question here in the chat.
Yeah, I was just going to raise that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think you just sort of answered it.
Okay, I'm not looking.
Well, let me read it out so that people can see it. So the question is, given modern, complex, lengthy supply chains for many products, will this make tariff effects much worse than in past trade wars, which I think you're saying yes. But there's a second part which is not as obviously answered by what you were just saying. Will it make the tariff effects harder to reverse if they are raised and then lowered?
I think there is something to that. If you think that investments are, I mean, if you close a plant, right, in Mexico, say in the maquila sector, that is the one that has all these exceptions, yes. And we saw Tarek studies this, uncertainty has grown a lot, and you start hearing of companies that now are thinking twice if they are going to open and continue plants next year, just because of the announcement, not even like anything happened. Right, so only that already is deterring. Yeah, that one is deterring investments, and yes, that's more longer term, because I mean these are plants. You need to sunk costs to rebuild them, and they can choose to go anywhere else. These are multinational corporations, are very malleable on where they can go. But just to finish on this thought, like this is not just small trade flow. These are two-thirds of trade happening in intermediates in these inputs.
Right.
So it's a big thing. Right?
So Tarek, this is your figure, is that right?
Yeah, so just to explain what this is. So this is looking at, this was actually in the Financial Times. This is a startup that we have out of BU. This picture was in the Financial Times yesterday. And essentially what this looks at is language in corporate earnings calls for US firms. And it measures how many sentences per earnings call are devoted to discussing risks associated with trade policy. So just to give you some example, so like in 2018, when firms were panicking about trade policy risk, it kind of topped out at 0.07 sentences per earnings call. Now we're already at twice that. All right, so the uncertainty generated is already double that today, and this is sort of on the same order. So just to give you a benchmark here, so the number of times you mentioned your competitors or something about your competitors is 0.09. Right, so firms are already more worried about trade policies happening here than they are about their competitors doing things. I think that's kind of worth reflecting. Now the worry is that this sort of like, one day off, one day on tariff kind of situation. So normally, we see them coming years in advance. We have all these papers about like, oh, you tell a company about like, there's going to be a tariff or a trade agreement in a couple of years, and they start changing their investments and so forth. This is something they're going to have to react to like potentially on, next Wednesday. So actually the deadline's coming up. So the other thing to drive home, like what Natalia was saying, and actually it didn't realize this. So like I first thought that this was going to be like a tariff on like value added within NAFTA. That's kind of like, that you kind of every time the car goes between Detroit and Toronto, like across the border, like 8 or 9 times. And I kind of thought that, oh, they're going to have a massive amount of bureaucracy trying to figure out how much they put in a screw in Toronto and now they bring the car back. How much is that screw worth? Turns out that's not even what they were planning. What they were planning is every time that thing goes across the border, you estimate how much it's worth and you pay 25% on that. Now, at that stage, it's no longer a question for is it 25% or 5%. It's just any positive number is going to basically shut down these plants on the border. So, yeah.
Because they already have, like, when you have these free trade areas with Canada and Mexico, there are rule of origin. So what Tarek mentioned about that you have to see how much of that screw came from Canada, it's already there. We need to do that when you have a free trade area, and that has a cost, an administrative cost that is estimated at around 30% of a tariff equivalent. So there is already like a big cost to cross the border, just even in this economy with your partners with zero tariffs. So you are adding to that, right? But I wanna go back to the trade deficit, because we are talking about the global value chain, and to again like stress Tarek's point about what is that also what we are measuring when we are measuring the trade deficit. So the typical example is the iPhone. I mean, we teach it also when we teach this supply chain. So the iPhone costs, say, $500. So when we import it, and we import $500, say, from China, right? And that's what we will tax eventually. But of those $500, very, very few was added in China. Like actually for the iPhone, it's like 3%, I think is the latest calculation. A big chunk comes from the same US. So like because the idea was developed here, the blueprint, everything. Then another chunk comes from Japan, like some of the essential, some of the more like high-end stuff that goes inside an iPhone or an iPad. So at the end of the day, like, you're punishing who? It's not obvious, because if there is a tariff on 500, then we're going to produce less of what we produce to go on the iPad, and etc., going back and forth.
Let me ask a question that's kind of related to this discussion that puts together several of the questions in the chat. So several people are asking questions about what is the rationale that the Trump administration has in mind. People are also asking, will tariffs cause foreign manufacturers to locate differently, which I think is part of what you're alluding to. And then finally, one person kind of puts this together, and let me finally finish with this person's question, saying one of the arguments the current administration is making in favor of tariffs is a long-run argument, that in the long run, suppliers will bring increasing amounts of production into the U.S. And how do you evaluate this argument? Either one of you that wants to tackle that one.
So can I say first, like, I actually think that Trump himself misunderstands the issue about whether a trade deficit is a bad thing or not. I think he just does. And I'm kind of baffled. Somebody mentioned Kevin Hassett. Kevin Hassett knows that the trade deficit is not a bad thing, and I'm baffled that somehow nobody has managed to like walk into his office and explain to him that Americans will not be better off if you remove the trade deficit, because you can only do that in equilibrium. You can only do that if you give up the investment surplus. Okay? So I actually think that there is a misguided view here that the trade deficit, and this is just like, this is really kind of why it matters to have sort of to listen to like your economic advisor sometimes, because they can tell you what the statistics mean. I think there's a real idea, and this is my impression, there's a real idea among some politicians that having a trade deficit in general is a bad thing. And let me just drive this home. Like, you can't, there's many economists who believe that you cannot have the dollar be the leading world currency and not have a trade deficit. Okay, so they're saying on the one hand they want to close the trade deficit, and on the other hand they get very angry when foreign countries talk about no longer using the dollar. Okay, these two things are directly contradictory with each other. And Trump actually said on camera, I had to laugh when I heard this, because he said something to the effect of, yeah, well, if they want to keep having, if Sweden or someone wants to keep having this trade surplus with us, then at least they need to invest in the US. Well, that's what they're doing. Do you think US, like, it's not like they're giving you these goods for free. You're giving them pieces of paper instead, right? So these pieces of paper constitute investment in the US. I want to say another thing about that, and I know it's going a little bit further afield, which is, and entrepreneurs from all over the world come to the US to start their companies, and these become global companies. If you want that to continue, it has to be possible for global investors to buy these global companies. So Elon Musk is a poster child example for this. Like, he's a South African, he comes to Silicon Valley, he starts a bunch of companies that are then floated on the world market. That can only happen if there's a net inflow of investment from abroad. You cannot have that happen on a large scale if you don't have a net inflow of investment from abroad. So, okay, to make a long story short, I think there's a misunderstanding about trade deficits somehow meaning that the US is losing. Yeah. And which, even on the surface, when you back up the bus a little bit, if you don't count like Monaco and Liechtenstein and like tiny countries, the US is the richest country in the world. We might not feel like it, but we are the richest country in the world. In what world does it make sense that somehow we're being fleeced by other countries? So we would be even much more richer than them if they didn't fleece us. No, so the only piece of evidence that they have about foreign countries fleecing us is the trade deficit. And again, I think that's misguided. Sorry, that was a long speech, but I think it's very important.
Yeah, I'm going to go a bit like even deeper on that. I will say that you cannot be the innovation hub of the world, the leader on innovation, without having a trade deficit. Because and Elon Musk again is the example. It's not any company. It's one that produces new stuff and new ideas. So it's all the innovation that we export. So we basically we call it, we export ideas and we import stuff. So, and that's not counted, and that's and countries that countries that have trade deficits like the US, and they can sustain it for so many decades, it has to be that there is this happening on the underneath. That is a very creative economy, very productive. And one paper, this debate was there in the beginning of the 2000s. The deficit had 25 years already, and people were wondering and having the same argument. Now it's much stronger, but there they have that, and there were many academic papers about can the US sustain the deficit. And then this brilliant paper, I think, came called Dark Matter, that says, no, wait, we export Mickey Mouse, and that's great. And maybe we cannot count it because, it's an idea. People is happy when they go to Euro Disney and other places and they watch the cartoons, but that's what we export. Then we import shoes and bananas and stuff, So being the country with the comparative advantage in innovation makes you naturally be the one with the trade deficit. Now, if you are a country that produces stuff, you have trade surpluses, and that's exactly what you see in reality.
In some
So let
sense,
me, let me,
almost like it's like the return. I don't feel like I learned about this in high school. Do you remember mercantilism? It was like this
Mercantile.
period in European history where kings thought that they needed to use like their armies to make foreigners buy their goods. That's kind of what we're going back to. And the point is the economy is it's different in two key respects. The first key respect is we're now financially integrated, meaning that we're not just separate countries and we have all we do is like trade these goods, but instead foreigners invest in the US. And by foreigners investing in the US, they raise wages for US workers directly. Why is that happening? Well, because because foreigners are investing in the US, the cost of capital for firms falls. American firms can install more capital per worker. And the more capital is installed per worker, if you remember your micro 101, means the higher your wages. So that's number one. We have financial integration. Number two is now the major thing that we trade in is services and ideas, right? So like BU is a major exporter of education services in a sense, right? That doesn't show up in the national account. So this idea that we want to like export more shoes than China is silly.
But
so sorry,
a
I just,
there is a reshoring
Yeah, go through
question.
some questions. Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
yeah, so there's a question that relates to what Tarek was just talking about, so let me jump to that one. So how does investment from abroad help lower income Americans? And you mentioned the raising wages, but the questioner asks if they don't have a job due to lack of industry in the US, they're not borrowing at lower rates. Who's lending to the unemployed? So how does it help with unemployment specifically?
Yeah, so you can't really expect, I think, foreigners to solve our domestic problems, right? So some people might think that like Elon Musk maybe has too much money compared to other people. Imposing a tariff on Mexico is not going to help with that. Like that's just like just because you have a hammer, it doesn't mean everything's a nail. I think the other way in which actually, so people have done the calculations that if you put a tariff on Mexico or in China, if you put a tariff on Chinese goods, who in the US pays more in the supermarket? And it's disproportionately low-income people. So there is this idea that somehow the tariffs are going to help low-income people in the Midwest, and just nobody knows how that is supposed to be achieved, right? So I don't like all the evidence is actually to the contrary. So number one, that's not the right mechanism, right? If you want to help poor people, if you want to help people who are unemployed, there's a range of other things that you can do, and tariffs are not the answer. Now, if you force me to say, is the tariff like, first of all, the tariff is bad for everyone. This kind of tariff we know is bad for everyone. And Kevin Hassett also knows that, by the way. And I know him personally. He knows that that's the answer. If you force me to now say, like, on the margin, is it less bad for high and low income people? Well, for sure it's worse for low income people because half of Walmart is full of Chinese stuff. Now, do you want to really make all of that like 25% more expensive? I don't think so.
Right.
Also, we have other instruments to do reshoring because this is connected to router reshoring, right? And we saw it with the previous administration. Also, we are talking here about massive tariffs. We also with the closest trading partners, right?
Yeah, so in some sense, these are very different things, right? So a tariff on Canada is almost like you're hurting your own team, right?
Yeah.
Because so Canada and Mexico are on Team GM and Team Ford. I guess they have lots of like catching up to do on other dimensions in the world market. But for sure, if you cut off Mexico and Canada for GM, I mean, some people argue they're not going to survive this, right?
In the US
not just
either.
because they can't sell their cars, but more because they can't make their cars. And if you force them to make them only in the US, like there's a reason why they're using Canadian screws, and there's like probably because they're better, or they can do some things that GM can't do by themselves, or they do it cheaper. So So that's like so Canada and Mexico really, in some sense, in the world market, are on Team USA. So by putting tariffs there, you're shutting off cross-border production, which has become really a big thing. Now, tariffs on China are a little different because, you know, it's not like you're flying things back and forth to China 5 times before they're finished. Probably some of it, but not to the same extent.
Right.
But and with the previous administration did something about that. We have 2 very big industrial policy laws. One is CHIPS, one is IRA, focus on subsidies to industries. You can say, well, we can discuss the details, the economists discuss that, but on the nutshell, projects were started in places where they were needed. And again, going back to innovation, these were like innovative technologies. So, and it creates new employment. Maybe you can argue that this should be done 15 years ago. Maybe that's a discussion we can have, but there are other instruments that is. And I think like to go back to the topic of this webinar is like, if we're talking about tariffs, I mean, we had the China tariffs in place since 2018. The problem is the uncertainty, right? It's announcements and nobody knows what's going to happen. And that also will deter the companies wanted to enter, or US companies or entrepreneurs wanted to open a new business. They're going to wait till they see a more stable landscape.
And you can see this, by the way, you can see this in just the first month. Well, I guess we've had 2 months of this tariff chaos, and it's shown up in consumer sentiment, which is somewhat surprising. But I think where you're going to see it is you're going to start seeing this in precautionary price rises. So if you're going to impose a tariff, like, it's worth thinking about how you're going to do that in advance before you find a microphone to say it into. Because now what's happening is that there's lots and lots of businesses who can only change their prices once a year, right? Now, the 25% tariffs have been on and off like twice already. So they saw that, and they're now starting to preemptively raise their prices in the middle of the Fed finally getting inflation under control. I mean, it's really, you couldn't think of like a more damaging thing to do for price stability.
Aside from price stability, I would think that the uncertainty also affects investment, which potentially triggers a recession. Do you see that as a risk?
I think the recession probability has dramatically gone up. I look every day at these at different at basically kind of looking at conversations in earnings calls and how they evolve. Concern about inflation has ticked up over the last couple of weeks again. Concern about supply chains has ticked up. There's a general rise in uncertainty, in particular trade-related uncertainty. Like, how big is it? I think we'll find out. I don't know. But certainly it doesn't help. Like, if you, yeah. But this is like almost like, how do you do it? Like, it's sort of, let me say one more thing. Like, if you really want, like, I kind of argued that, like, maybe we shouldn't close the trade deficit, but let's say you really wanted to do it. The best way of doing it is by getting the federal government's finances under control. So by raising domestic savings, basically, that's the way to do it. Remember, and I think the best way of seeing this is that essentially what happened last time when tariffs were imposed, foreigners were still wanting to buy US assets, and the exchange rate just adjusted, and nothing happened to the trade deficit at all.
Why don't we pick up a couple more of the questions that have come in? So let me back up to one that came a little while ago and I didn't get to yet. What will be the effect of tariffs in countries like Puerto Rico who are forced to buy directly from the US? Either of you that want to take that one on?
I think there's lots of weird regulations that sort of force Puerto Rico to buy goods from the US and not take direct shippings. I think those are generally I mean, federal policy towards Puerto Rico is very schizophrenic. Like on the one hand, there's like these tax benefits to try and help the place grow. On the other hand, due to its geographic location, it would benefit from having its direct trade access. So Puerto Rico, like the more you screw up U.S. trade policy, you're also screwing up Puerto Rico for sure. Maybe more than other places because naturally they might be more natural importers of things.
Another question, is there any industry or person who benefits from tariffs, the tariffs being proposed?
Well,
I see you both nodding.
yes,
Go ahead, Natalia.
there is again, there is like the domestic farm producing this thing. If you think that you produce it, that is this famous example during the trade war of washing machines, and washing machines were taxed. And we have the companies in the US, Whirlpool, that produces washing machines, right? And they benefit, but also they benefit because they have an exception on the import of inputs, right?
Mm.
In the US, you can declare the land around your company a special economic zone, and you can import duty-free. So again, like they kind of bypass the problems with their global value chain. I mean, the steel was there. And of course, washing machines were more expensive. And by the way, this paper shows that there are goods that are bundled. So when you consider the effect of tariffs, you have to consider, say, the washing machine, but also you always buy the dryer with the machine. So both increase and the tariff went on combo, and that's what happened. So yes, they benefit. But again, they could circumvent the global value chain. And we weren't talking about, say, like high tariffs on everything. There was like, say, washing machines and things like that. So maybe
you could already see it, right? So it's like somebody says 25% tariff and then everybody nods and then goes out the room and then sends their lobbyists to like on everything except for this and except for the things that I need. But for sure, then like leave the 25% on my competitors, right? So go back to my beer example, okay? I'm very convinced that like American beer is not as good as the German beer. And, they've been trying for like hundreds of years and it just has not worked out. It's not for lack of trying. I want to get my beer from Germany. Some, and there's sort of like, some of it is if there's a tariff on German beer, there's going to be a bunch of US consumers that are going to go and start drinking Bud Light. So who wins is always the person who is protected from import competition or who gets like whatever exception that they want. So it's essentially, you can already see it. So a friend of mine runs a lobbying firm in DC, and you can imagine like the phone started ringing off. It's great business for them. We actually have like a paper in the QJE where we show that when political uncertainty is high, the firms that experience a rise in political uncertainty, they respond by sending their lobbyists to DC to get exceptions. And of course, like we're going to have 25% tariff on everything. And then except this, except that. You can already see it with like Doge also. We're going to fire all the government workers. And so, but hang on, what about the doctors who work for the VA? Oh, not those. What about the people who administer the benefits for the 9/11? Oh, no, not those. What about the people who work on bird flu? Not those either. Right. And then, it goes like until like you run out of until you get to the people who don't have their lobbyists in line quick enough. Guess who that was? That was the USAID, right? There was no constituency for those who were quick enough, and then those were the people who actually got fired. So that's kind of how these things work in DC.
But even that, I mean, again, the global value chain, even the lobbying gets affected because going to the past, there is this famous case of sneakers. Two companies, you can imagine which ones we're talking about, they were like fighting for different tariffs. The one that outsourced everything and produced the sneaker abroad wanted low tariffs. I mean, they wanted to import the sneaker, and the other ones that import the inputs and produce the shoe here, right, wanted the sneaker tariff, not the inputs. So even like in a very narrow, same product, two companies want very different things. in terms of tariffs. So which one will get them, right? So that's going to be, like, we call it rent-seeking behavior, because you want to get those exceptions and you need to spend money on those things. So like hiring tariff friend costs money. So, and those are, because we load the economy with frictions, then we have to go and spend all this extra money to get rid of them individually.
Okay. Let me bring in something that hasn't we really haven't talked that much about yet. One thing that at least some people seem to have in mind is using tariffs as a way to raise revenue for the government and to, you know, substitute tariffs for income taxes or other form of taxes. Is this a useful way to raise to finance government spending, or is it inefficient as a way to do that? Again, either of you want to take that on.
So there is you know, in history, they keep saying like it used to be that way. It used to be that the government was financed by tariffs. That's true, but those were the reason governments were doing this is because the only thing they could control was the border. If you're a government that has no way of controlling what's going on in your country, and the only thing that you have is a soldier at the border, then the only way for you to raise revenues is tariffs. Now, if we're now discussing, is a tariff more distortionary than an income tax? Like, for sure, number one, like you can get nowhere near, like with all the tariffs in the world, you can go nowhere near. I don't think that you have a realistic trade policy where you're going to be lowering income taxes significantly with tariffs. They're very distorted. It's a very costly way of raising revenue, which is why when the World Bank sends people to build state capacity in developing countries, a key thing that they want to build is capacity to raise income taxes. That's a key, like it's a complicated thing to do for a state. And these developing countries typically rely on two things. They rely on tariffs and they rely on the central bank just printing money, so seigniorage. Right? Those are the two things that even if nothing else works in your country, those are the two things that you can still do. So the idea that we're kind of going to go back and behave like Malawi, you know, Malawi is not behaving like that out of choice, but out of necessity.
It's a condition. Yeah, it's like when you're, because it's historically you see it in proto states, in states that were in formation. And in the modern world, you see it in poorer countries in general, that they have to resort to this type of tariff, of taxes. But the capacity, and also there is this idea, right? It's like things are not static. When you put a tariff, and we've been talking about this for the last 50 minutes, if you create a recession, it means that you're going to charge those tariffs over something that is much smaller. So it's not obvious how much revenues are actually are going to be. It's going to be undone in some sense. So it is always endogenous, right? Like we put tariff, there is a recession, you have less days to raise them, etc. So, but again, like yes, a modern state, it's a sign of a modern state not to have to raise tariffs and be able to have an income tax, a well-working income tax.
And to really stress this idea that the foreigners are paying the tariffs, I want to say it's completely wrong, but it's like 90% wrong, right? So it's just a different way of taxing Americans. You could also say we're going to finance the entire U.S. budget by taxing, by taxing, some necessity of daily, by taxing water, right? We could do that and see what happens. Like, the reason we don't do that anymore is because you can't get like, so I guess like another way of thinking about this is like these kind of, these taxes on very particular things. Tariffs is just one of those, right? So you have a tax on cigarettes, you have a tax on import. Sure, like you can have all of that. Those are just all different ways of taxing Americans. And there's a reason why income taxation is preferred, because it's kind of, in a sense, less less distortionary if you need to go to the, if you need to finance the government.
I think the more direct comparison, if you imagine you increase the sale tax by 25%.
Yeah, I think
Right.
25% is not going to be enough. Yeah, but
Or
yes.
something
Yeah.
big. Imagine like every state, every city does that.
So another question from a name I recognize. So I'm going to leave her anonymous, but I'll say hi. So the question is, what about the anti-redistributive aspects here? In other words, if your goal is to favor the wealthiest and you can't have a flat income tax or a sales tax for political reasons, does this become an approach that you might take?
Then let me bring an example. Like, because people relate, like sometimes like screws and tires, those are like companies deal with that. But they're I think they're already in putting taxes on what is called the minimis, like $800. The ones that you're allowed when you travel and you come in and they ask you something to declare, you are free till $800. Okay, so mainly there is TikTokers in the audience. Like all the things that you can buy on TikTok come from, they send you to online vendors that have Temu is the big one that sells the whole business on this thing that you can sell below $800. Okay, so those are important, are huge. They grew exponentially since the U.S. trade, the China war. So, I mean, yes, it's like an insane amount. It's like 10 times it grew, this type of commerce on this platform. And then we have research that shows that is very pro-poor, like this type of exemption, because who buys these products from these online vendors, disproportionately in China, are like people that lives in, we don't know the people per se, we cannot know now, but we know that are in areas that are like lower income. So
Right.
a tariff, there is a calculation so that, for instance, tariff on this particular type of goods, forget about farms for a moment, it will be pro-rich, basically. It will be very regressive. Because, and these are like, we are talking about t-shirts. I mean, teenagers use a lot this platform. So, and daily products. Let's call them that way. Yeah. So yes, you can fix the tax code on other. This is not the instrument. That's what we're saying.
Right.
Actually, if there are also papers that shows, like for instance, like female products get disproportionately higher tariffs than male products. So there is also a gender bias in how we apply tariffs. So yeah.
If you just think about like the mechanics of sitting down and deciding what you're going to put tariffs on, I think there's sort of like economic theory for what you should do. But in practice, I don't think that's being followed at all. And you can sort of see like it's a free for all, right? So like, where you have, okay, once you start down that road.
Right. All right. How about one last question? I think we just have time for one more. So if the U.S. implements high tariffs and reduces investment in this country, what country or countries would seem to stand to benefit the most?
So I want to say, I'm an immigrant here myself, and I kind of used to have this view that like the US is not all that exceptional. I still think that in some respects, but in one respect, I've really changed my mind here. I think the US has a very unique role to play in the world economy as sort of a hub for innovation, bringing together people from different places to innovate together and then export those ideas and applications elsewhere. And there's really nowhere else in the world that can do it at the same level. The UK is kind of like somewhat similar in the sense that like it communicates with all parts of the world. So I actually think that this is not a zero-sum game at all. I think, like there's a lot of thinking nowadays that like, oh, if we kind of don't do this, somebody else will do it. They will do it, but they will do it at a higher cost and not as well. And, at a time where, I almost feel like we're sort of, not to be overly dramatic, but like, aside from all of our political problems, there are some real physical problems that humanity has to solve in terms of like, destabilization of the climate and changing of our energy infrastructure and so forth. And who is well positioned to figure out an answer here? Yes, somebody in a lab in France might do it, but it's more likely to happen here at MIT with a startup in Kendall Square, right? Or it's likely to happen, in the I think you understand what I'm trying to say. Like, so I think hobbling the U.S. in this way is not a great idea.
Basically, you're saying like if everybody will lose. Everybody will lose.
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
I
especially
think
if there is a trade war. Like, and again, we knew what happened in the past when the whole world started engaging on this game.
Yeah. So to put a fine point on it, essentially, a full-scale trade war was a prelude to the Great Depression and World War II. Yeah. So if you
that's a
really want to
cheery
let
note
it
to
get
end
out of
on.
control, yeah.
No, seriously, we do have to go. We're kind of out of time. So I really want to thank Tarek and Natalia. It's always a pleasure to see you both. Thank you all for attending. As you may have seen posted there, we're going to be posting the recording on the Arts and Science website, so you have a chance to see it. We'll be following up with everyone by email to give them that link. And again, thank you all for coming.